Welcome to another episode of the ASF Podcast. I'm Tanja Janko and I'm host of the science vertical of the ASF Podcast. And today we are joined by Dr. Michael Graziano, a leading neuroscientist and a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton University. He is author of several influential books, and he is best known for his Attention Schema Theory, a framework about which we'll be talking about today. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So just to start off, what was the first thing that sparked your interest in this topic?
Well, I think that probably most people in neuroscience or psychology early on are fascinated by this topic. Actually, probably most people in the world are fascinated by this topic. What is this consciousness thing inside of us that sort of feels like it's there hovering in us? What is that? How is it related to the mind and the brain, physical reality? These are things that I think everyone asks about. So it had always been a kind of a background interest of mine. I think I started to study it in a sort of serious way, began to devote lab resources to it when a couple of threads of thought came together. But one of them was related to actually when my son was very young. He was 3, and I started to make his stuffed animals talk. And we started to do this sort of ventriloquism thing together. I would, make the little guys talk, and it was fun. And I began to realize that there was something kind of special about this ventriloquism trick, that we perceive mind and consciousness in things that move and act like people. And that's kind of a social illusion. And that kind of started me on this whole line of thinking, sparked the actual lab work on that topic.
Before we go to this question about, not question, but before we go into depth of how we attribute consciousness to other non-living beings, maybe I can just ask you to define consciousness. What is consciousness for you?
Yeah, that's obviously a very good question. People have different definitions of it. I mean, that word means different things to different people. And we actually did a study recently where we just asked a large number of people, define consciousness. In your own words, what is consciousness? Because scholars talk about this all the time, and they argue, and you have papers that say everyone knows this and that. And you're like, well, what does everyone actually know or think? And so, but by and large, most people think of consciousness as either the internal feel, the experience, or agency, the ability to choose and act, or both. Some combination, one or the other, something like that. That's what they think of consciousness. And so most people in philosophy focus more on experience. So to most people in philosophy, consciousness is not the ability to choose, or your memory, or your sense of self. It's simply the ability to have an experience. Like, when you look at something like a red apple, you don't just process it is red. You experience redness. So that would be, for most philosophers of mind, it's the experiential side. For me, I would say there's a very easy, precise, more scientific definition of it, which is consciousness is a self-model. Because cutting across all of those things, what you're doing is you're asking people, tell me about yourself. Tell me what's going on inside you. Tell me what it's like inside there. And so in every single case, what you're getting is people reporting on some kind of self-concept, some kind of self-model. So their cognitive machinery is accessing deeper information and then arriving at some story and then saying, this is who I am and this is what I have inside of me. So consciousness is a self-model, and it's a very quirky, specific kind of self-model. And that's what we study basically in the lab, is that self-model. What generates it? What is it? Why did it evolve? What good is it? Would there be use in building the same kinds of self-models in machines? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And so on. So that's what I would say. Consciousness is a self-model.
So you often also talk about, I think this is also from your books and also from your TED Talks and so on, same thing as I said before, so that we often attribute consciousness to animals, to machines, to fictional characters. You are claiming that we're doing something similar when we are also attributing consciousness to ourselves. It's a very complicated way of thinking about this, I have to say, because when I was thinking, so my brain is attributing consciousness to itself, a complicated model. So please correct me if I'm understanding this wrongly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's essentially correct. So, I mean, that's what a self model is. It's a concept of yourself or version of yourself that is built in your brain that's probably not fully accurate. Kind of cuts corners on the details, and then your brain is effectively saying, "This is who I am." So you're, in that sense, attributing that set of properties to yourself. And that set of properties is a pretty good approximation. And therefore, it's useful to have that knowledge about yourself. And then a very similar process we think goes on when we look at other people and we look at them and we essentially build a model or a set of information about the other person and attribute mind and consciousness and emotions and so on to the other person. We think very similar machinery in the brain is doing this. It's probably a little different. I mean, you have much more data on yourself and it's continuous data, and it's probably a much paler, less intense version and less detailed version when you look at other people. But I do think most people experience this sense of almost like you feel other people's mind and emotions and consciousness almost emanating out of them. And that's, I think, because it's the same kind of machinery in the head that's building that construct of that person's consciousness, this person's consciousness, my consciousness. We sort of live in this sea of perceived consciousness.
So, vision of consciousness, then hallucinating our reality. This I think similar came up when I had a discussion with Carl Friston when he was on the podcast. He also said that we are kind of hallucinating our reality and that we cannot actually have the access to another person, which of course we cannot, from his point of view.
Yeah. But I would also just add to that, that's true. But most people have, and most philosophers have had this notion, well, I have access to myself and not to you. But I would argue you don't actually have access to yourself in any complete sense. That you're building guesses and simplified concepts and often incorrect inferences about yourself, just like you are for other people. I would say you have more data on yourself. And so your model of yourself is better and richer, but I don't think you have direct access to all the details in your head. I don't think that's true. I think there's something very similar between how we understand ourselves and other people.
To go on to the theory, you said you propose that the brain builds this internal model of its own attention, which you call attention schema theory. Could you briefly explain this theory to us? What is it meant to solve?
Right. So, yes, the brain builds models. That's kind of what it does. I think a lot of people are beginning to realize that one way or another, and people use different terminology around that. You mentioned Carl Friston, and he tends to think in terms of prediction, but that's the same thing. So, when you have a system that predicts something, the system has built a model that it's a predictive model. It's a little like a simulation or toy version that allows you to predict. So more or less, lots of us are beginning to realize, okay, that's what brains do. They build models of things. They build models of the world outside of us. Those models are pretty good, but not perfectly accurate. They build models of ourselves. Anything that's important in your world, anything at all, you need a model of it so you can make predictions about it and help control it and decide what to do next on the basis of that. So one of the most important things that we have in our world is attention. And I think because it's so ubiquitous, it's everywhere all the time, people tend not to see it. It's one of those things that's so obvious that people don't notice how important it is. But attention means simply your brain is focusing on something in order to process it deeply. Like that's what attention is. And so attention is the key to everything we do. If you don't pay attention to it, you don't really respond to it. If you do, that means you know it's there, it's in your mind, you respond to it. That's literally what attention means. If we had no such thing as attention, then we'd be in trouble. Our brains would need to be like the size of a planet because we'd have to process everything equally. But this way we have this efficient system that can select a few items, deeply process those at the expense of everything else. That makes us intelligent with a relatively small 3-pound brain up in there. So attention is the key. Attention is everything. Attention, when people talk about their minds, like this is in mind, oh, that I forgot that, I wasn't thinking about that. What they're really talking about is what's in the cone of my attention and what isn't. Attention is everything. And it's so important that the brain needs a predictive model of it. The brain needs to know what its attention is doing, what it's likely to do next, what the consequences are, what the uh, how it should control attention next. So it should understand its own attention. And so we proposed quite a while ago, about 15 years ago now, I had proposed that the brain builds an attention schema. It's a schematic or simplified model of attention. And the initial problem that it was supposed to solve is, how do we control our own attention in a meaningful way? Well, we have this model of it that helps us keep track of it and make predictions so we can control it. And one consequence of that is, so I'll give you an example. I don't want to go too long on this answer, but I'll give you an example. The idea of an attention schema parallels another idea, the body schema. And so the body schema is this great innovation or great discovery from about 100 years ago, that the brain doesn't just control the body, it also builds a kind of simulated little cartoon version of your body inside. And that's your internal sense of your body. It's your internal model of where your limbs are, and that you have two arms and what they're doing at any moment and so on. That's your body schema. That's gives you your sense of your body. And we don't really notice we have it until something goes wrong. Like if you get an amputation, most people end up with a phantom limb, a phantom arm, and there's nothing there. But you close your eyes and you're like, oh my God, I have an arm still and I can feel every little detail of it. Well, that's your body schema. Your brain is still building that model of your body and saying, I still have an arm. So we know we have this internal description or model of a body that helps us move and control our real body. And there's two consequences of that. One is it helps us move, and the other is if you ask people, their higher cognition can gain access to that model and start answering questions. So you can have people close their eyes and tell you, oh, my arm is over here right now. It's moving this way. So we have cognitive access to it. So what does an attention schema do? Well, the main thing is it helps you control your attention, because it tells you where it is and what it's doing and predict what it's likely to do and so on. So it's very important for everything we do all day long, every moment of every day. We need an attention schema. But the other thing it does is you can ask people about it. You can ask them, well, tell me what's going on inside you right now, right? And their higher cognition can access that attention schema, that model of attention, and they start saying things related to that very simple description. They start saying, oh, I have something inside me that is like a way of mentally grasping objects around me. Right? That's a simplified model of what attention is. Oh, I have this thing inside me. It's like an essence that allows me to focus on this and understand it. And so what they're doing is describing consciousness. But that description, then, we think that description, when people describe being conscious or consciously aware of something, having a conscious experience of something, we think what they're doing is there's this higher cognitive machinery and linguistic machinery, and is gaining access to this deeper automatic model that's keeping track of what their brains are focusing on. And so they're reporting these kind of this in simplified language, almost cartoon version of what their attention is doing. So that's what we think is going on, is that the claim, the insistence, the belief people have that they have a magic essence inside their heads is the result of having an attention schema, and then a higher cognition that can gain access to that attention schema and talk about it. So that's very quick, maybe somewhat condensed version. That's what we're working with.
In your latest books, you also pair attention schema to global workspace and integrated information theory. So could you also tell us how your theory compares to these two, and maybe just give a brief introduction for somebody who might not be familiar with those two theories?
Yeah. So both of those theories, and most theories of consciousness, deal in processes in the brain. I mean, most theories deal with processes in the brain. So let's start with the global workspace theory. It's, in a sense, it's a theory of attention. So right away, it's very similar in some ways to attention schema theory. So the global workspace theory says some information gets boosted and increased due to internal mechanisms, and the signal gets stronger until it gets into that central global workspace where it's now available. The rest of the brain has access to it. So anything in the global workspace is something you can talk about and you can choose to act on and so on. So it's a description essentially of how something like I don't know, the coffee cup next to you got boosted into the highest levels of attention. So you're paying enough attention to it to respond to it. And that's great. That's what the global workspace does. I think it's a wonderful theory. I think as a theory of consciousness, it does an exceptional job at everything except it doesn't explain consciousness. Like that's the one part of it doesn't actually do. Because then why would a system like that? So you have a system, you look at a coffee cup imagery gets into your global workspace. Wonderful explanation for how you can say, there's a coffee cup. But why would that system then say, and I have an experience of it? It's not just there, but I personally have an internal experience of it. Like that's not in the explanation of the global workspace. You need an extra step. It's not enough to have that information about coffee cups get into your global workspace. You need a self model. The system has to know what it's doing. And so you need this final step where the system says, not only is there a coffee cup, but I have that coffee cup in my global workspace. In other words, I'm paying attention to it. And this is what it means when I pay attention to it, is I am conscious of it. So you need the self-model. So in a sense, attention schema theory is the global workspace theory with this added step. You have to add that extra step. You have to have, sometimes people call it metacognition, or thinking about thinking. The system has to have a model of itself. And then the two theories become the same theory at that point. So integrated information theory is another. I'll just say straight up, I don't believe integrated information theory. A lot of people are very down on it, let's just say. It's a very divided field. I think integrated information theory is basically a kind of magicalism that says that it's like alchemy, you put the right ingredients in and then poof, the magic essence comes out. And I'm not at all concerned about being undiplomatic there. I think it's a total nonsense theory. The idea is that if you integrate information enough, then experienceness emerges. And there's, again, one of the deepest problems there is there's no explanation for what, if you do that, if you put lots of integrated information together, and then the feely thing emerges, how does that feeling experience then turn around again and very specifically impact neurons in just the right ways that it allows you to know that you have it and say that you have it? Like, there's no explanation of that. Like, explaining how a feeling emerges is one thing, but explaining how the emerged feeling gets back to the brain and affects your cognitive circuitry and your linguistic circuitry so that you can specifically say you have it. There's no explanation of that. It's a very deep problem with most, I would say, essentially all theories of consciousness, except theories like the attention schema theory. But at its heart, the problem is still the same thing. Integrated information theory lacks a self-model. You can't, if you ask someone, are you conscious of it? What is consciousness like? They can't answer that unless they have a self-model. So you always have to have this added self-model component. Otherwise, the theory doesn't work. So again, that's where the attention schema theory comes in. It basically says you have self-models. This is a very specific kind of self-model. And this is the one that explains this particular kind of claim people make about themselves.
I think that I also really liked about your book, which I fully also nicely ties into this and how we are trying to understand this theory, or the evolutionary origin of consciousness. And you really start from sponges, how we share of the genes, but they do lack the nervous system or the complexity to have all of this. Could you tell us something about the evolutionary origins of consciousness?
Sure. If we're right, then first you need to evolve a nervous system. Then you need to evolve attention, the ability of a brain to focus deeply on some things at the expense of others. Then you need to evolve the ability to have a model of your own attention, a self-model. And at that point, then you have at least the rudiments of this thing we call consciousness. And to be human-like about it, then you need to evolve the cognitive ability to access those models of yourself and think about them. And then you need to evolve the verbal ability to talk about it. That would be the human-like version of it. But I think probably other animals lack the higher cognition or have very little of it and lack the language, and yet they still have the simpler components of that. So yeah, it's a long evolutionary process to get there. I would say humans and many other animals have taken it that one step further, where we also model other creatures and attribute consciousness to other creatures. So there's that social step as well. But when you sort of look at the evolutionary history in vertebrates, you get really attention mechanisms coming in at some level, maybe 500,000,000 years ago, but becoming more and more elaborated. And you get the kinds of attention that are really necessary for this theory coming in. I don't know, you see that in birds and mammals and reptiles. So they share an evolutionary origin maybe 300 million years ago. And so somewhere around there, these basic mechanisms begin to come in. And maybe we would call those conscious in some sense. And then, of course, the higher cognition doesn't come in till much later in evolution, and language doesn't come in till humans. Nobody knows when. That's a debate, but let's say at most 2 or 3 million years ago. So these components come in bit by bit until finally we get this creature that can go around claiming and arguing that it has consciousness, and having philosophical debates about it. So it's a very interesting evolutionary path. But I would add this one extra point. That's the vertebrate path. And not a lot is known about invertebrate neuroscience. I mean, a lot is known, but at the kind of cognitive level, less is known. And so there are people who argue that, for example, octopuses may have evolved very similar mechanisms on an independent path. And that's totally possible, but I don't think that's really known yet.
Exactly. This is also one of the things that we were covering in one of the other episodes where we talked with Pena Guzman, is working on animal consciousness.
Yeah.
You said consciousness is also quite important in social settings. We said that a system would be important for consciousness to arise.
Yes.
Okay. Because otherwise, I think it would be a very slippery slope into panpsychism.
Yes.
Because, I mean, anywhere you look, say, if we look at fungi, they still have an interesting way of how communicate through mycelia, things like that. So you maybe some level, or maybe as a panpsychist, somebody could claim that they have some sort of subjective experience.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people claim that. So how shall I put this? Well, first of all, no. Panpsychism is nonsense. So panpsychism is the idea that everything has consciousness. And you run into this problem. And lots of people have convinced themselves of that. Lots of people who are supposed to be scientists have thought themselves into corners and tangles and got to this place where they're like, it must be panpsychism. So if everything, like if toenails and snails and feathers and beds have, and planets have consciousness, I'm not sure the word means anything anymore. That everything has this, then it's not a specific meaningful property anymore. I don't know what that is anymore. But also, I think it stems from a fundamental mistake that lies at the root of almost all thinking about consciousness. Almost all thinking about consciousness starts with this assumption. It says, well, I have a subjective essence inside of me. It's not a physical thing. It's just a feeling. How does it get generated? And as soon as you ask the question that way, I think you've put yourself out of business, because you may think you have that. You may believe you have that. But here's the problem. Everything you think and believe derives from bundles of information in your brain, constructed in your brain. And those bundles of information are never really fully accurate. So you probably don't have that. What you have is bundles of information, or a self-model that describes you in that way, right? And so I'm going to go back to the analogy of the body schema, because this is very useful for me to think about it. And when you imagine somebody trying to understand a phantom limb, right? You cut your arm off and then there's this ghostly limb. How is it there? How do you have a phantom limb? And you go back before people really understood it. And there's really two classes of explanation. And one class of explanation is, well, the brain built a model. The brain built information about your body, and the information's not fully accurate in that case. Your arm is physically gone, but the brain says the arm is really there, and that's why you have a phantom limb. And then you introspect, or you close your eyes and you're accessing that model, and your cognition says, aha, the arm's there, and you talk about it. That's one class of explanation. A totally different class of explanation is to say, no, the invisible ghost arm literally exists, and is sticking out of the stump. I'm just going to assume it to be true because my internal models tell me it's true. Therefore, I will start with the assumption that it's absolutely true. And now I will pose myself the question, how does a stump generate an invisible ghost arm? And now I'll generate theories like maybe there's so much information integrated in the stump that it makes a ghost arm emerge. Or maybe there's like a quantum vibration thing and so on. Now you get stuck, right? And then if you come up with an explanation, which is definitely going to be wrong, but if you come up with an explanation, you say, there, that's what generated the ghost arm. You have a second problem, because how does the ghost arm floating out there in space that nobody can see, how does it affect your brain, your neurons, in such a perfect, specific way that you know it's there and can talk about it and tell people about it? Like, how does that happen? There's no explanation of that. So this is precisely the problem people run into with essentially almost all 99% of theories of consciousness are dedicated to answering how does the ghost feeling emerge? And they fail to address how does the ghost feeling then impact the brain so we even know we have it and can talk about it. But it all derives from a fundamental mistake, which is assuming the ghost feeling is actually there as such. All we know is the brain constructed that way of describing ourselves, right? And so the attention schema theory basically is a theory that says, well, this is why the brain built that self-description, because it's useful. It's not perfectly accurate, but it's useful. So once you get to that realization, then there's no such thing as consciousness in things that can't build self-models, because that's what the whole thing is. There's no phantom limbs in things in creatures that can't build models of their bodies. There's no such thing as a phantom limb if you can't build the self-model. There's no such thing as the consciousness essence if you can't build a self-model that tells you that you have it, right? So fungi don't do that. They don't build self-models. They can process information. Single cells, they can process information. They're really sophisticated. Trees can process information. It's all this wonderful work of like trees and their roots connect to each other and this and that, sort of like James Cameron's Pandora Planet, where they're all talking to each other. Like, you can have amazing amounts of information processing, but if the thing isn't building a self-model that tells it that it has these properties, then it won't go around thinking it has conscious essences inside of it. So there's no consciousness just emerging out of the cells and the fungi and the this and the that. You have to have the self-model. You have to have the particular kind of self-model. So I think that's a very logical, simple answer. But anyway, that's my long-winded answer to that panpsychism question.
That you were just mentioning this example of phantom limb, I just came to my mind that I never actually looked into it, if did any experiments with animals who were missing a limb or something like that, if he were kind of experiencing, I guess it would be like they wanted to like on the leg that was not there or something like that.
That is a really good question. I actually don't know of any research on phantom limbs in animals. I mean, there's research on some of the internal brain processes. Like, you can look in a somatosensory cortex and look at where neurons are reactive. So there's a part of the brain that responds to touch on the arm. And if you cut the arm off, initially that part of the brain goes silent, but then it starts to become responsive again to neighboring body parts like the shoulder and the face. So there's some of that work. But I think the thing about phantom limbs is it's fundamentally about people reporting what they experience. And so I don't know of any animal work on it. It'd be really interesting, though.
It's a little bit more difficult to study because there's no verbal reporting on it.
Yeah,
and I think
that's
with
right.
people, of course, it is always
That's right.
easier.
I think the same thing's true of consciousness. There's a lot of people who try to study it in animals, but you have that basic problem that it's really about people making verbal claims about themselves.
Exactly. Also, since we were still talking about the panpsychism example. I mean, of course, if we in the conversation, the book from Oliver Sacks and out of the experiments, but mental patients with different mental diseases. Also, this is also incorrect. It is not mental diseases. It is what's the word right now? Different conditions, let's say. It's also a very difficult thing to explain those kind of conditions with, let's say, panpsychism, or also, let's say, the split brain experiment. That is something that, in my opinion, would kind of disprove panpsychism, because there are basically two people existing in the same brain. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are certain facts that tend to get ignored or forgotten, like the spinal cord has more processing power in it than most living animals, but it's not part of our consciousness. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are not parts of our consciousness. The consciousness part of us seems to be very limited in a sense. So it's not enough just to have neurons together doing something to say, that must be conscious, that B is conscious because it has complicated behavior and it has a nervous system. Because there's all kinds of complicated things we do that are totally outside our range of consciousness. Anyway, yeah.
Consciousness is also important and has also developed in the context of social mind, being in a social environment, existing with other people. How did this explain the origin where have this self-attention, or how does this contribute? How does existence in collaboration or among other people contribute to this?
Yeah. So one of the questions people sometimes ask me is, well, which do I think came first? Building models of self or building models of others, attributing consciousness to self or to others. And I don't know. But I think if I had to guess, I would say self models come first. One needs those to control one's own internal processes and one's own behavior. So I'm guessing that came first. But at some point, you can adapt that to model the behavior of other people. And just to give a kind of the same analogy, this body schema analogy, we evolved a model of our own body, but we actually use some of the same machinery to look at other people and understand other people's bodies and how they're moving and interpret the behavior and movement of other people. You can show the same brain areas light up that help understand and move our own body parts when we look at someone else moving and we try to figure out, well, what is that person doing? So the same brain areas can evolve for this personal reason and then get co-opted for these other reasons or extended for these other reasons. And I'm guessing this is what happened. And I'm guessing this happened relatively early because you see really rich social interactive behavior, what people call theory of mind, or the ability to build theories of other people's minds. You see that in birds and mammals, and birds and mammals share a common ancestor like 300 million years ago. So this is probably from a very early time, but of course, it elaborates and gets much more rich in some species, like in humans. But I think it's crucial. I think that it is at the heart of who we are as social animals, that we understand each other as conscious experiential beings. And I think it's kind of the heart of our cooperativity, right? It's not just that I can predict your behaviors and now I can manipulate you and get resources out of you or something. I think it's part of our cooperativity and our empathy. And if we didn't do that, I mean, sometimes people get cynical and they think humans are kind of jerks and sociopaths. But actually, it's a relatively small percentage of people who are like that. And every single day that, I don't know, you go into a grocery store and there's literally thousands of people there and nobody's murdering anybody. Like, they're all getting along more or less. Nobody's trying to punch people out to get to the front of the line. It's very rare that that happens. So on balance, statistically, we're an extraordinarily cooperative species. And we do it because we look at each other and see mind and consciousness and experience in each other in the same way we see it in ourselves. And if you could take that away suddenly, just like somehow suck it all out of our brains, then you go to a supermarket and you look around and you're just faced with a bunch of objects that are in your way. And so why not just cut them down and get past them? So I think this is really at the heart of who we are. So it makes us human. It makes us pro-social, makes us who we are. So the fact that everywhere around us we see consciousness in things, in people, stuffed animals, and as you pointed out, in characters and stories and so on. We live in this sea of perceived consciousness, and I think that's hugely important for who we are as a species.
The thing that you also have in your book is this false belief task. I think is a really beautiful way of describing, or this kind of test is a really nice way of doing this social intellectual mind, or like attributing consciousness to other, or understanding consciousness of another person. Would you mind describing this for
Sure.
our listeners?
Yes, absolutely. First described by Wimmer and Pertner, the false belief task was an attempt to try to really prove that one person understood that another person has a mind. And the way it works is you tell a story to someone. And the story goes, the classic story is the so-called Sally Ann task. And you tell the person the story. Sally and Ann go on a picnic together, and they have two baskets, basket A and basket B. And Sally puts, I don't know, her sandwich in basket A and covers the basket, and then goes to the bathroom. And in the meantime, Anne sneakily takes her sandwich out and puts it in basket B and closes the covers. And now Sally comes back from the bathroom. Which basket will she look in first? And most people, you or I, would say, well, she's going to look in basket A because that's where she thinks the sandwich was. But if you ask very young children, like 3 years old, they'll say basket B, because that's where the sandwich is. Why would she look in a different one than where the sandwich is? She'll look in basket B. And the reason is because at the age of 3, these children don't have a theory of mind. They don't realize that Sally has a mind that holds information that drives her behavior. And the information in her mind could be false, which would drive her behavior in the wrong direction. And so, in a sense, that's often used as a probe or a way to test whether an animal or a person has a theory that someone else has a mind, is to face them with some version of that false belief task and see if they pick basket A or basket B. I failed the test the first time I took it, by the way, because I overthought it, as so many people do. I was thinking, okay, Sally comes back. She probably thinks Anne snuck her sandwich somewhere else. And so then, you get into the second guessing and layering. But anyway.
And it's been also shown that some animals are able to pass this test. Yeah, it seems like also a good way to test whether a person or a mammal or
Bird.
animal,
Yeah.
the ravens, right? Ravens were
Yes.
one of the animals that were able to
Yes.
pass this test. Consciousness. I think it was also in your book where you said that this would be also a great test alongside Turing test, or this would be like one level higher of the Turing test.
So, but I would caution that the false belief task is a very complicated task because you really have to keep track of a lot of variables. And so it is possible for animals to have some theory of mind, to have some concept of the minds of others without quite having the intellectual capability to solve the false belief task. So it's a very stringent task. I think probably theory of mind or this social ability is much wider spread than just the false belief task, which is really cognitively intense social thinking. So the Turing test, most people don't know, but Turing, 1950, who proposed the Turing test, he didn't call it that, of course, but the test he proposed is not the one that people talk about today. It's much more complicated and much more interesting. And the one people talk about today is you talk to a computer, and if you can't tell that it's a computer, then it's passed the test, right? That's the Turing test. Let's chat with it. And if I can't tell if I'm talking to a computer or a person, oh my God, it passed the test. And the problem with that is that's really easy to do, actually, especially now. And but of course, the easiest way to do it is just to get a little kid to talk to it, and then the kid won't know. And so, it's really easy to get things to pass that test. What Turing did was propose a really rich, complicated social interaction where the details are maybe not that interesting, but there's really 3 players. So let's say you are up against player A and B, and you're all talking 3-way by text. And player A is a man and player B is a woman. And the job of player A is to convince you that he's the man and the other one's the woman. And the job of player B is to fool you and to think it's the other way around. And so they're both trying their hardest, one telling the truth, one lying, and trying to persuade you socially. And you have to guess which one's the man and the woman. And then you get a point if you win. And then you repeat and repeat and repeat, and you develop a set of statistics of how good you are at this task. Well, now take one of the A or the B and replace it with a computer and see how well the computer does at fooling you or telling you the truth. That's the original Turing test, which basically is, can the computer behave in a way that's so richly social and complex that it can understand and manipulate other people to a particular end? So that's miles beyond the original Turing test. And, I doubt that LLMs, these large language models today, like ChatGPT, can really perform at a human level on those tests. But it's not going to be long before they do. They're a little clunky still.
I agree.
On really subtle social interactions. So while they've all passed the Turing test as people have kind of falsely conceived the simple form, I don't think they've passed the actual original Turing test yet. Give it 5 years.
Exactly. So I think that artificial intelligence or artificial consciousness is a real possibility in the near future?
Absolutely. Because if we're right, if this is a matter of having attention and a model of attention and so on, having the right self models, yeah, of course, it's all buildable. I think it's buildable. I think as these machines, these LLMs learn, they may well already, in some instances, have some of these self models. At some level, they're already developing that cognitive machinery. And I think if you want machines that are not sociopaths, then they probably need that in them. And certainly if you want machines that can really integrate well with people and not just seem a little bit doofy and hilariously wrong now and then. I mean, there's like 1 billion YouTube videos out there about the mistakes that ChatGPT made. So if you really want these machines to be much more integrated or interactive with humans, probably you do want that. I think the problem is, in public perception, making something conscious means giving it agency and making it capable of kind of deciding to go out there and do its own thing, right? Giving it autonomy. But I think machines already have that. Like, they don't need to be conscious in order to go around doing things that we don't want them to do. That's not the problem. You give them this concept that we have of a conscious mind and this understanding that everyone has it, that we're all conscious beings. And now you're starting to build in some of the tools that we use to be socially cooperative. And I think that might be a useful thing, actually.
What would you say are the main pillars that are still missing with the current models that we have for them to really be like on the level where they could integrate?
Human-like consciousness. I mean, on that narrow topic, the consciousness topic itself, that's something that we're trying to look at the best we can, trying to understand it. These machines are hard to understand. So there's a lot of people who are looking at so-called mech-interp or interpreting the innards of these machines. And that's something that we're trying to do as well. So they spout out words, and a lot of people mistakenly think, well, they're just putting out random words, or not random, but one hears this statement over and over. The LLMs, large language models, are merely doing word prediction. They're not thinking, they're just spitting out sentences and words that are predicted to be the right ones. Well, the problem with that thinking is people are the same. All we do is spit out muscle contractions. We predict what is the best sequence of muscle contractions. That's all we do. But in order to do that, we also have to have layers and layers of deeper and deeper cognition that represents the world and ourselves at higher and more abstract levels. Otherwise, you can't effectively control your output. And these large language models do exactly the same things. Yes, they spit out words, but they do it because they have deeper and deeper layers in their neural architectures. And in the deeper layers, those neurons are representing higher and higher level abstract cognitive concepts. So they have to have that, otherwise they can't do the things they do. They're not just spitting out words. They have these deeper level cognitive constructs. So there's a lot going on in there that's quite extraordinary. One thing they lack, or that makes them different from people, is their type of attention is different. They really don't have human-like attention. They don't seize on a small number of items and focus on them and process them with great depth and then not look at other things. So the very foundation of this stuff, this consciousness stuff, at least as we understand it and as my group has thought about it, this attention thing is different. It's a different kind of thing in a a machine than in a person. And so if a machine built a model of its own attention, it would look really different from a human attention schema. And while we attribute, a magic mental essence that can focus on this and know that, that's our way of understanding our own attention processes. Large language model might have a totally different kind of attention schema that we wouldn't even recognize as consciousness like. So if you really want to build a conscious machine that's human like conscious, that thinks it's conscious in the same ways, you probably have to figure out how to build something that has the same kind of attention that people have. And I don't think that's been solved yet. I think that's probably the hurdle for that particular question. A lot of people say, why do we want to build that? We already have, the machines can do really amazing things anyway. They have their own kind of attention, leave it at that. But if you really wanted to build them human-like, that's one of the main things I think you'd have to work on, is human-like attention.
Part of your book is very, very interesting to me was when you spoke about loading minds, or cloning a person, and then you have actually this kind of similar to Mickey 17 movie. I don't know if you have seen it.
I haven't seen that one, but there's lots of media out there on mind uploading. Yeah.
So it is basically cloning a guy, and then him and a lot of other rich people are sent into space. He is basically being used as a prop to test environments in other potentially habitable planets. If he is killed, then they have his mind and all of his body stats uploaded, and they just print another version.
Yeah.
I think this is something similar that you also discuss in your book. And you fall into a lot of different ethical and moral questions and dilemmas. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a quagmire. I think we probably won't have to deal with that quagmire for a little while because, building a conscious machine is one thing, giving the machine the same kinds of cognitive structures that people have. But copying a person's brain in sufficient detail that you're literally capturing the person, the mental person, that's a totally different technological problem. And I don't think, it will depend on technology that has not been invented yet. And one never knows the future of technology. It could happen, but I think the problem is you'd have to scan people. The best initial theory is that you would need to scan every neuron and every synapse or connection between neurons and scan the synapses at such a detailed level that you can see how big they are. They get bigger when they get stronger, and see what kind of synapse it is. Is it an inhibitory or an excitatory or a modulatory? And then you put all that together and build an artificial version of it, right? That's the initial guess. But even to get there, you'd have to scan at such a resolution over such a large amount of brain that we don't have that capability. And then once you get there, if some amazing new technology comes along, and then you try it out, you're likely to find out that it's not quite right, and that there's a lot of other cells that do stuff that you have to scan as well. And so it would be a long development process once you even get to the point of scanning at sufficient detail. And the only thing I would say is I don't recommend being an early adopter, because you don't know what's going to come out the other end. It would not be a happy mind, I think, at first at least.
True. I be honest, I don't think that we are, or any of the listeners are in the bracket of wealth where they would be able to afford that.
Yeah, well, there's that too, yes.
We are slowly coming towards the end of the podcast. Is there anything you would like to share about current work or about something that we didn't cover in today's conversation?
Oh, let's see. I'm not sure. I guess the only thing I would say is the study of consciousness in the past was philosophy. For some people, it was religion. It was a little bit psychology. Neuroscience got hold of it. But at this point, I would say it is turning into such an important chunk of technology that it may be one of the most important topics that we have right now. So the reason why I say that is because AI, the rise of AI, is probably the biggest transformation in human history, bigger than invention of writing. Some people would argue that it's a new form of matter, like life. It's not living, but it's a thinking matter. And therefore, this transition is on par with the transition from non-living chemistry to life 4 billion years ago. So we're looking at something huge. We're looking at something that could potentially be trillions of times smarter than any person ever was and travel anywhere because it doesn't need to breathe oxygen or live in a protective bubble environment. It could go anywhere. This is transformative at a level that's beyond comprehension. But none of that happens unless it has this thing that people think of as consciousness, this sort of internal agency and experience that makes it capable. Otherwise, it's just a tool. It's just another backhoe that lifts things like heavy objects, only that it lifts intellectual heavy objects for us, but it's just a tool. Understanding consciousness, what it is, whether it's buildable, turns out to be, in a sense, the key to this massive, giant, absolutely pivotal moment in the history of life on planet Earth. And so suddenly this somewhat obscure philosophical question about consciousness, what is it, turns into this linchpin, this crucial moment, the question that determines the future. So that's putting it in proportion.
Yeah. So for a final question, do you have any recommended reading for somebody who would be interested? Of course, there are your books and research, but is there anything else that you would like to recommend to people who would like to understand maybe your view or something that is similar or builds on your theory or preceding theory?
Yeah, whoa, you put me on the spot there. I don't think so. And I hope this isn't just arrogance. But I don't think so, and I don't think so because most work on consciousness really starts with the assumption that there's an essentially magical thing inside of us. How does it get there? And then there's the work that I've been trying to do, which is saying, no, it's not. It's information processing. And so I think I would not make a specific recommendation other than go read my books.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us in this episode. It was lovely to talk to you.